All right, so the final subject that I think is really important for beginners to get a handle on that will essentially help you on your journey to become more knowledgeable, pay attention to what your body responds to, and ultimately be able to gauge as you train the level of stimulus or effect that you are applying to your body, which is really, really important. Because if you're in the gym and you do a set and you immediately notice that it hasn't really done much for you, then you know that you might need to increase the weight or increase the amount of effort that you apply, or it could be a guide that you need to alter your technique. These little pointers and markers of biofeedback can be a really great guide to make corrections and improvements as you continue to train without having to pay attention to the advice of anybody else. You will learn essentially for yourself what works for your body, and everybody is essentially their own test experiment, so this is a really essential thing for you to get a handle on. So let's say you perform a set and you want to know if that has basically stimulated sufficiently muscle growth or whatever adaptation you're looking for. You want to know the level of stimulus that it's provided for you in order to make sure that you're doing things in a way that's going to maximize your progress. So, as I said, there are several different markers of essentially biofeedback that we can pay attention to. And before I get into that, we do want to acknowledge that you should be applying relative effort. If you haven't got a handle on training intensity and proximity to failure, I would encourage you to go and watch my video prior to this one on training effort, training intensity, and relative proximity to failure. So the reason I say that is because it's the easiest box to tick. When we ask ourselves, could we have done more in that set? Then if the answer is you could have done more reps, that's a really easy box to tick. And just next time you go into your set with the intent that you're just going to push yourself a little bit further outside your comfort zone. Now, there are other variables outside of training effort that essentially come together to create the stimulus that we essentially apply to our body. Now, training range of motion, training technique, the exercises that we select, whether they're effective or not, these are all variables that if you haven't got these things right, essentially what you do won't be as effective as you might like it to be. So yes, we can train hard. If you're using a poor exercise with terrible range of motion and jacked up technique, it's just not going to do too much for you. So we want to make sure that everything is going fairly well and your body's responding. So yes, we've checked the box of training effort level. You're fairly confident you're training hard enough. You probably couldn't have done any more reps even if you tried. Fantastic. Now, in order to assess the rest, the first marker that I would encourage you to pay attention to is at the end of your set, whatever the target muscle that you were training was, how much blood flow and how much of a pump did you experience to that muscle? Because if you get just a little bit of a pump and you walk away from a set thinking, well, I didn't really lift that heavy and I could have controlled the weight better and I wasn't really being conscious of what muscle group I was contracting in order to move the weight, and you only got a little bit of a pump, you can add all those things together and think to yourself, well, I probably shouldn't be so sloppy with things in the future. And then you go into your next set, you really control the weight, maybe you increase the weight if that's the appropriate decision that you've come to. You're really being conscious of which muscle is contracting, where you're maintaining tension. You walk away from a set thinking, oh my God, my quads are absolutely on fire. They're so pumped. That can be a really good sign that you've done something that is a little bit better than your last set, and you should continue on that trend. Now, number two is how much weaker that a muscle gets after a given set. Now, in your training program, let's assume you do an average of 3 sets per exercise. It's very rare that you would only do one. We will at least do more than one. So, in this example, we're going to do 3 sets. So if your first set, you do a set, and you train as hard as you can, and you control the weight, and you walk away from the set thinking, oh my God, my quads are so unbelievably pumped, and then you rest what you feel is an appropriate amount of rest time or what's been prescribed on your training program, you go into your next set, and you find no matter how hard you try, you were only able to achieve 10 reps, whereas in the first set, you were able to achieve 13. That is a weakening effect that is fairly significant. And that tells us that your first set, where you performed 13, that weakened you so much, was such a stimulating set that your ability to perform that again was reduced massively on a set-to-set basis. And that's actually a really good guide. We should noticeably feel weaker by a fair margin every single set we do for a specific exercise for the same muscle group. So the weakening of a muscle group or the exhaustion effect of a muscle after performing an adequate enough set should be noticeable. So that's number 2. And then number 3 that I would encourage you to pay attention to is if you perform a training session and you apply yourself a lot more, and you're thinking about all these things that I've described, and you're really making an effort to push yourself outside of your comfort zone in any description, and you wake up the next day after sleeping well, after eating the same food, but you notice that nothing else changed apart from how hard you worked in the gym. Nothing else changed, and the next day you wake up and you're more sore than usual, that can be a really good sign that you have essentially walked the path of improvement in terms of what you're doing in the gym. Now, I just want to say this, and the reason I've placed this one last is because training soreness or muscle soreness is not always the best guide. Muscle soreness can often just be a sign of poor recovery. So let's say you don't train harder than usual, but then you sleep terribly and you miss a couple of meals and you undereat your protein and you're really, really stressed and you're running around at work and everything's bad. You can expect your recovery to be quite poor. Then you would probably also wake up the next day quite sore. But let's say all those things are good. Stress is good, sleep is good, food is good. Essentially your recovery is good, and you wake up the next day after just pushing yourself harder and having a really good session. Then you wake up the next day and you're more sore than usual. It can be a fantastic sign that you've done something very, very productive. So essentially those are the main ones that I would use, more particularly the first two, but in conjunction with the first two, the third one can be a powerful proxy as well. But I would encourage you, no matter how you gauge the biofeedback from your body, pay attention to it, because essentially over time in training, your body will tell you what it will respond to well by sending you essentially signals. So paying attention to these, you can learn your body, you can learn its responses, you can pay attention to the progress you make, and you might become more knowledgeable about your own personal experiment. So that is it, how to essentially gauge the level of stimulus that we're applying to the body in a particular training session. I hope this helps.